France submitted, and the process of Anglicization began. By the time of Henry VIII's death in 1547, most of Ireland had agreed to obey English law. The subsequent programme of administrative reorganisation involved the setting up of counties or shires, much on the English pattern. These shires were administered by assizes, as it were committees, rather like the modern county councils that we have today. And these assizes were composed of local landowners drawn from all over the region. The town of Ennis was chosen as the assize town in the new county of Clare, and this meant that during the following century, Ennis gradually expanded, but the expansion wasn't at all spectacular. By 1650, the town was still commercially insignificant, paying no more than £16 annually in taxes. But a few merchants were beginning to build substantial houses, among them John Crews, whose house, still standing beside the abbey, dates from 1658. Across the road is what is left of Carmody's Hotel, partially destroyed by fire a decade ago. Daniel O'Connell frequently stayed here, as did Charles Stuart Parnell. The story goes that Parnell met Kitty O'Shea in Carmody's. Just up the street and north of the abbey is Crow's house, now the police barracks. Ennis in 1680, a sketch by an English traveller showing Lenthall's Inn, and to its right the abbey. At first, Church Street, now called Abbey Street, was residential. As the town expanded, the road followed the rising ground up from the marshland around the abbey. With increased trade, the houses were rebuilt. Few of the originals remain. As you go up the street, growing prosperity is shown by the height of the houses, changing from 2 stories to 3. Apothecaries and saddlers, 9 grocers and 3 distillers. These, with the respectable town clerk and the occasional attorney, lived in this street in 1788. Across the road, in the oldest part of the street, a house in which Patrick Sarsfield may have taken refuge after the disastrous Battle of Aughrim. Alongside its site today, fine specimens of Elizabethan chimney stacks remain. The tallest house in the town, 4 stories high, belonged in 1840 to a merchant named James Leach. By then, shopkeepers had successfully ousted the tiny professional class who had lived in the street, and to whose prosperity we owe the solid stonework above the shop fronts. By 1730, the thoroughfare from the abbey had been built up as far as the site of the present O'Connell Memorial. On the photograph, the development can be seen clearly. From a point where the causeway linked with the abbey, a street had developed on the high ground to the south of the River Fergus as far as here. At this time, about 300 years ago, Ennis was a one-street town, but now it was to develop rapidly, and it did so in 2 directions. On the one hand, Abbey Street continued as High Street, following the line of the river, and going east towards the site of a mill which was then outside the town. This street is now Parnell Street. The other development, a road to the south, linked up with a jail, also outside the town, and continued into the turnpike as the main route south to the city of Limerick. This street has been renamed O'Connell Street after the Liberator. Looking straight ahead as one emerges from Abbey Street, the line of the old road is clear, straight into Parnell Street. Parnell Street was and still is mainly commercial in character, a street full of atmosphere even today, with picturesque laneways leading to the river. In 1788, 7 of the 11 shopkeepers here were linen and woolen drapers. Ennis was then the centre of a thriving and expanding trade in cloth, cloth made in the homes of the country people outside the town. Nowhere in Ennis is the feeling of its past more felt than in Chapel Lane, curving away from High Street. Chimney stacks on a house at the corner of Chapel Lane are almost as old as those we saw near the Abbey. Now that Ireland is beginning to appreciate its architectural heritage, Chapel Lane would seem to be very much the kind of inheritance that the people of Ennis should wish to preserve. A chapel from penal times, now a youth centre. The chapel, indeed, from which the first bell in Ireland rang out to celebrate Catholic emancipation. When it was built in 1735, the chapel probably stood on the very edge of the town. The lane itself was built later on. Once the most densely populated part of the town, its old houses are gradually falling into disrepair. The memory of Daniel O'Connell lives on in the old houses of Ennis. Elected to Westminster as member for County Clare in 1828, he was the first Catholic in Parliament since the introduction of the penal laws, and his election made Catholic emancipation inevitable. From then on, Clare became a radical county in Irish politics. Parnell was to be a frequent visitor to Ennis, to be followed in this century by President de Valera. At least 3 generations of McNamaras have lived in this tiny 200-year-old house in Chapel Lane. Frank Diver McNamara was a boy drummer in the town band long ago and well remembers travelling to Dublin with the band to support the Clare football team in the early years of this century. He remembers, too, the Chapel Lane of his boyhood, its shops, and what could be bought in them.
There was an eating house selling pig's heads, cooking pig's heads, threepence a quarter a half, six and a half pound for pig's heads and tea and bread and butter. About 200 years. 200 years. My grandfather down to myself now, about 200 years.
Beside a mantelpiece carved by himself in younger years, Frank McNamara dreams of an Ennis that has all but disappeared. In his grandfather's time, the cloth trade of Ennis fell into decline. By 1840, the bleach mill and the tuck mill had disappeared. The livelihood of some of the families in Chapel Lane then must have been gravely threatened, if they were not forced into total poverty. Chapel Lane ends in Market Square, a convenient route back to O'Connell Street, the main business area of Ennis today. In 1842, the novelist Thackeray probably walked along here. There seem to be some good shops in these narrow streets, he wrote. Among others, I bought for 18 pence 6 volumes of works, strictly Irish, that will serve for a half-hour's gossip on the next rainy day.
Next week, we shall see how the remainder of the town filled in and how the events of the last century, including the Great Famine, left their mark on Ennis. In the meantime, see if you can get hold of an aerial photograph of your town or a street map and ask why of its location, its shape and its size.
Look. Developed beyond the old jail along a road which in 1735 became a turnpike, a toll road where traffic was only allowed to pass when payment was made and the restraining pike turned aside. The name turnpike is still in use here, although the line of the old road has disappeared into a new housing scheme. Nonetheless, some of its old character remains. The turnpike was the first modern road into Ennis, and along it travelled the coaches from Limerick. It is past these cottages that Daniel O'Connell and Charles Stewart Parnell must have made their way into the town. Just as O'Connell Street stretched into the turnpike, Parnell Street continued as Mill Street. But expansion in this part of the town was relatively slow because the land tended to flood. Small industry characterized the street. 3 soap boiling houses, 2 distilleries and 2 tan yards. And it was also the main centre of baking, with as many as 11 bakeries. The shops in Mill Street, on the whole, catered for the necessities of life rather than the luxuries. By the 1840s, the tanneries and distilleries of Mill Street had closed, the street disimproved. Living conditions in the laneways must have become increasingly dismal. At the end of Mill Street, which is now part of Parnell Street, is a little square with a house made famous in a well-known song. For those days in my heart I will cherish, contented although we were poor, and the songs that we sang in the days we were young on the stone outside Dan Murphy's door. Dan Murphy is long dead, and the stone outside his door disappeared some years ago. In Ennis, the word bowway is used to describe the tunnel-like covered passages which gave pedestrian access to the hundreds of small houses off the street. From these came the workers in the complex of grain mills and stores at the top of the street, an area which was to become known as the Corn Market. All this commercial development meant that Ennis, a century ago, had taken on this shape. 2 main thoroughfares leading to the entrance to Abbey Street, the intervening spaces filled in. Lanes and bowways extending back from Parnell Street to the river. At the bottom of Parnell Street, a big new road was built to cater for the increasing traffic to the mill and the corn market. This then was the extent of Ennis in 1840, just about 10 years after Daniel O'Connell had won Catholic emancipation. At that time, in the space between the older Parnell Street and the newer O'Connell Street was the town's market square. And that square in 1840 would have been a great deal busier than it is now, because the population of County Clare then was nearly 300,000, 4 times its present number. Nonetheless, Ennis has held on to its Saturday morning market, one of the diminishing number of Irish towns to do so. Originally, the market was held on the outskirts of the town, but gradually stores and shops grew up around it. What began as a loosely huddled open-air trading place, in time became the built-up market square, properly called the Mall. The prices of pigs and calves in 1840 were a fraction of what is paid today, yet it's doubtful if the hard process of bargaining has lost an iota over the years.
That's going 5, that's the price. If you do that, they won't give no more. The price is 5, go on, that's it.
I can't take it.
Why can't you take it?
Very good yourself. 360p, I know.
Go on, that's it.
What's up with here? I'll tell you, hold up the hand up. We'll quick look on it. Is that all right?
Price is 5.
Hi.
The price is 5 and give them whatever you like. Go on.
I can't take it.
Yeah, go on, you can't take it. You'll get some other one.
Quit back on the 60.
The pigs that go to market in Ennis nowadays are carefully reared for maximum profitability, and their owners are a great deal more sophisticated in the techniques of farming than their predecessors who crowded this same stretch of street a century and more ago. Nevertheless, the Saturday morning market is as much a social occasion now as then. In fact, a modest prosperity has probably made the weekly outing less crucial now than in the bad old days when necessity hardly ever made a good bargain. Nowadays, a market is one of the sights of a country town, much beloved of tourists and cameramen. Yet we know that even around the year 1800, this weekly market in Ennis was a magnet for the town's blades, who gather there to watch and jeer their country cousins. An account from the period reads, "The streets of Ennis are crowded with young loungers that had much better stay at home and endeavour to redeem their properties. It would surely be more beneficial than annoying the shopkeepers with their bald, disjointed chat." These early juvenile delinquents, the sons of the local gentry, finally found a less irritating pastime than disrupting the business of the market. They began to patronize the town's latest attraction, opened around 1820, a coffee house in the market square.
We lost that. Oh, we've been too smart. I thought Brady was going to eat from both the knees.
Mikey, yeah, didn't you?
Plastic flowers, cheap fashion, and factory-made tools find a brisk trade on the Saturday stalls. Tractors and lorries replace the traps and carts of a century ago. But although transport and customs change, the market still revolves around the sale of animals and produce. And it is still a strong social link between the town and the surrounding countryside.